Welcome to Scene, where the art world meets the real world. Every 2 weeks, we sit down with emerging and established artists to offer a genuine glimpse into their lives and minds, all in an authentic and totally straightforward manner. I'm Carrie Scott, your host. And with 2 decades of experience as a curator and art historian, I firmly believe in the transformative power of art, if it's seen. Have you seen Tom de Freston's work? Have you read his books? It's all about the drama. Tom's art is like stepping into a mythological tale. In our conversation, he shared how his paintings explore human struggles through surreal imagery, and we talked a ton about the ways in which he wants us to think about ambition and downfall. But the thing that I wish I'd done before we sat down to have our conversation was I wish I had read all his books, especially his latest one. Because I think that the thread throughout all of his projects is that Tom makes himself confront really deep themes and deep emotions, but he asks us as the viewers to do that too. So this isn't easy. The conversation isn't either, but I really, really think it's worth the time. Tom, hello.
Hello.
How are you?
Really good, actually. Slightly nervous. I don't know why, but yeah, but ready.
Nervous.
Yeah.
I did not think you, of all people with so much output, would get nervous. Tell me about why you're nervous.
Why am I nervous? I think my brain has a tendency to, once I get away from specifics, make incredibly vague general statements. So I think I'm always nervous when I'm talking about my practice in the round, because there's a danger that you just say, almost like fridge magnet cliches. So I always have to have that in the back of my head, like, be specific, otherwise you're just going to say things that don't mean anything. So yeah, and also I like the idea that more and more my work's been about kind of being vulnerable, like, and lots of the subject matter in the work is about that. So I'm always a bit nervous talking about it, whereas writing about it, you're in kind of complete control.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I almost don't want to start at the now, but we should go into it. This book that you're about to release, even in the small snippets that I've read, have sort of made me pause. Why don't you introduce the book? It comes out, what, in 2 months?
Yes. Yeah. God. Wow. Yeah. Beginning of May. So that is soon. The book is called Strange Bodies, and it's my second narrative non-fiction book with Granta. And the writing is kind of, so I'm a painter and artist, and the writing's kind of come about by accident, in that I've always been interested in the idea of like pulling the curtain back on the studio. And one gallery who used to represent me said, "Oh, you need to kind of not reveal the mystery." I think they had this worry that it was a bit like Wizard of Oz, like, you pull the curtain back and there's nothing there. And that, I'm really stubborn, so that made me even more stubbornly think, I completely want to reveal the mystery. Like, a bit like when you learn the science of how a rainbow works as a kid, you're like, that's even more amazing. So lots of the collaborative stuff I do, lots of the writing is all about that, really. So I really see the book as another form of painting, but it's using language to explore the painting. So it's kind of what's going on in the studio. So specifically, Strange Bodies is, I suppose, a story of the pregnancies and miscarriages, of which there were 6, that my wife went through across like nearly 3-year period. And then, slight plot spoiler in that we now do have a daughter, so it has a happy ending. And while these miscarriages were happening, kind of inevitably, like quite a few years ago, I got rid of the idea that the personal doesn't creep into the work. I've kind of accepted that, like, the boundaries of the studio are porous, and it creeps in ways that are really hard to map. So not like I'm always painting what's going on in my life, but that they're obviously just in relation to each other. So I started to make these paintings that I knew in some ways were about what was going on. So about desire, loss, grief, about what does it mean to witness the person you love most in the world be going through something so painful that you are obviously like intimately connected to, but is not you're not having the bodily experience. And I started to become interested in the ways in which that corresponds to like the spaces between lovers or between any two humans, but you know, it's more charged between lovers or like life partners, kind of corresponds to the space between an artist and an artwork or a viewer and a painting, in that it can never be fully crossed, but your desire to, so I suppose it's about empathy really, like your desire to enter those experiences becomes really important. So the book is kind of about, it's a memoir about all those losses, and then it's about the paintings that I was making during that period, which increasingly became a return to the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice and the idea of thresholds and underworlds, and like the other or the lover as a kind of figure, the other side of that threshold, particularly if there's this sense of you feel like you're losing them, there's a distance growing, or at times the opposite, like a proximity. And it also became about these very charged encounters I was having with other artists. Titian's a kind of figure, Titian and his poesy paintings that runs throughout the book. And then there's loads of other artists. It's kind of an idiosyncratic array. So like, it's not an art history book. It's not like there's this clear program as to why these artists are picked. It's like, I'm having these intense experiences with them along the way, and I'm kind of pooling and learning lessons and gathering material that's going back into the studio, but also helping me through maybe what we were going through. And it's trying to like speak really honestly to what it is to encounter those things and how that fits to the personal. I mean, that's a very clunky, that's not an elevator pitch, is it? But that's the book.
But when you say encounter, so what? You just would like come across a Titian and draw a parallel to what was happening in your immediate world? Or did you go and excavate some art historical works?
No, it's a really, really good question. And there's different answers probably for, so this Titian runs throughout the book, and then there's like a different artist or artwork in each chapter. Sometimes there's a few, but as roughly as structure, there's kind of one per chapter. Titian and his poesy paintings, I've been fairly obsessed with for about, like nearly 20 years. And just before the first lockdown, the National they'd gathered the poesy paintings together for the first time. I think this is right, for the first time since Philip II had them. So it was like this unique moment, and it was just before, it was one of the last public events before lockdown. And I went to see them, and the painting, the Rope Europa, which I mean, I know all the paintings really well, but I was stood in front of this painting of like, you know, erotic desire and violence, and it's a really troubling painting. And there was this fish in the bottom corner of it that I've somehow never noticed before, this fish like emerging out and gasping for air and kind of flickering in and out of life. And the way Titian, I mean, often the way Titian paints, but like this particular detail is like a microcosm of this. Like, he paints in this way where the paint's just holding on to like its ability to be representational. The fish is kind of just there. So it's like it's in the process of emerging into being and then collapsing away into just abstract marks, which is obviously like all painting is just that. And for some reason, it really spoke to me. And I didn't quite know why. And it kind of sat in the back of my head. And like often is the case of these encounters, it's kind of you leave and it sits there. I'm trying to remember the chronology, but it basically then Kira, my wife, became pregnant with twins. And there was something about the kind of early images of them and the sound of the flickering heartbeat, the kind of the just sense of presence in the scans. That I was like, that's the fish. Like that's just the fish. And then I kind of like, I had this idea of making these paintings almost like prayers, or I'm not religious at all, but like prayers and a kind of things of hope. And I was going to make like a painting per day throughout their development. And they weren't going to be like, they were just going to be for us. They weren't meant to be like, I don't know, for public consumption. And then obviously that was the first of the miscarriages. And that carries a particular like weight. Does it carry a particular weight? There's something particularly different about it because it was twins. It just makes, and it was the first loss. And And yeah, so that fish kind of carried with me throughout the entire book. And then it then meant I was kind of returning to Titian, his whole career, I suppose, but particularly those paintings. So the Percy paintings, I should say, are like Philip II gave Titian this brief where he basically just said, you can take anything you want from Ovid, as long as it involves, pretty much as long as it involves nude female figures from different angles, take any story you want. And then Titian goes and makes these extraordinary paintings of desire, loss, violence, the male gaze, moments of mutation and transformation of the sacred and profane, of myths, of transgressions, of animal and human hybrids. But it was like I came to them with completely fresh eyes. And so then that serendipity wasn't there throughout the book or the journey, because as I went through, I was like, no, now I want to kind of hunt out paintings and people who feel like they speak to what's going on, but not with any like program of this is something I'll write about. Just, like I would normally kind of build like an archive of references in the studio for stuff I'm making. This felt like an archive of things. So like if I was going to construct this underworld around what we were going through, then it felt like I needed guides throughout. So there's coherence in that they're all kind of about boundaries, all about underworlds. Some are abstract painters, some are figurative painters, but there's no coherence, and like it jumps about art history. I mean, all over the place. Like, it's kind of, and I like that. I like having no kind of academic, or no academic methodology. But I'm not trying to be an academic. I'm an artist writing about painting.
I have so many. We have to go back. We have to go to the beginning. But before we do that, right? Like, I think there's an incredibly, obviously I haven't read the book, dying to read the book. I've read one of your books. We can talk about that in a minute. But I think that you've like grabbed onto a bit of a zeitgeist here. And there's, I'm going to say this so badly. But I don't know if you've looked into or read anything about matrescence, which is this notion we've ignored it, right? Adolescence is something that we talk about in the hormonal changes that happen, but people don't much look at the shift that happens when you become a mother or even a parent, right? This like giant hormonal thing, right? If they cut open my brain today, you would know that I had 2 kids and you would know that they were both men. But we kind of ignore that massive thing that happens. And I believe that the imprint, I've not personally experienced a miscarriage, but I think that from the second as a woman that you become pregnant, something changes drastically. And that change happens, I think, throughout your entire parenthood. And my point is that Hetty Judah has talked about this a ton, and she, in lots of her talks at the moment, is getting this question, and she's been quite public about this over and over. Why don't you ever talk about men and fatherhood? And she's like, I don't have a good answer yet. And her thing is, maybe it's because not enough men or fathers have talked about it. And if you look at art history, there are a few great examples of artists looking at fatherhood, but it's not the bulk of their work.
Yeah.
So I love the idea that you have taken an experience that so few people talk about, and try and find sort of totems, art historical totems to walk your way through it. It's not a question, just a statement.
Hetty Judah is, I think, doing kind of extraordinary work. It feels like she's doing the work of like what should be a whole institution around motherhood and creativity, and at every level, at political levels, at artistic levels, and she's extraordinary. I think she's now bringing it's like people are catching up. And obviously there's a lot of catching up to do. And there's also Lucy Jones's book, Matrescence, which is remarkable. It's interesting. I don't know if it's I felt terrified writing this book, as in, was it going to be a transgression? Was I writing about this experience that isn't mine to write about? And then eventually it came down to, I thought, I don't really, beyond what Kieran thinks. So my wife's a writer, is a novelist. And I think that's relevant because she's a far superior writer and thinker to me. And I thought, if she reads it and is happy with how it's expressed things, then I'm happy. But then what's interesting is, like, as it's moved on, where people have said, oh no, we really want this perspective. And I think as long as you're writing from where you stand and you're not trying to colonize or claim ownership or knowledge of experiences that you can't, then hopefully you're less likely to go wrong, is my sense.
Yeah, imagine your malehood and your position in society as a white man, right? It must be a daunting. I'm going to write a book about miscarriages. Can't imagine. I think that's quite brave. Anyway, thank you for writing that book, and I can't wait to read it.
Thank you.
Let's be deliberate here. I want to talk about how you negotiate these two, what are like visually different things, right? Your work is kind of all about bold strokes, and it's quite visceral and it's emotional, and there are these like thought-provoking landscapes. And then you have the books, which, not knowing you, they feel like two different things that kind of touch on each other. But I want to know, like, how did that happen? Why did you start writing? Where did the work start? Like, when you meet someone in a taxi cab, and they say, what do you do? Do you say, I'm an artist, or do you say you're a writer?
So I think there's two answers to that. One, I think I now say I'm an artist and writer, but I think if I'm really honest, I'm a painter, and everything I do is just another view in on painting. So the books to me are like, I'm not saying the books are painting, but they're like an exploration of painting and what painting means. And in a strange way, they kind of free up the studio practice, because rather than feeling like, obviously painting as a language is just so different. And rather than try and make, which I was maybe doing for years, like trying to make paintings that kind of express everything I'm thinking and feeling, it feels like the books can be the space where I start to do that. I start to use language as a way in to kind of get at the thoughts that I kind of think painting by its nature is like an act of mourning. And you make paintings and there's all this stuff going on in the studio at every level of like layering a painting up almost like archaeologically to ideas that are in your head as you're making the paintings. And then by the time you finish that painting, you're like an actor leaving the stage. Vast amounts of that stuff leaves with you. And then what you leave is a kind of a site ready for a viewer to come along and to excavate, to kind of keep the archaeological thing going. And my thought was like, writing could be a space to kind of explore that process and explore those losses. And then you free the painting up at the end, not to be weighed down by all of that, not to feel as if you're suddenly having to write around the paintings or justify them. And you just say, here they are. And maybe frustrations of the art world. Like, I find myself very uncomfortable even existing within whatever, the whole discussion around what do we mean by the art world. But the commerce of painting I find tricky. Whereas the commerce of publishing I don't find tricky, because the majority of people, if they would like to, can purchase and read a book. Most paintings are unaffordable to most people. And I find that tricky. Yeah.
I did wonder if it was for you a way to just open up your audience, right? More people can put their hands on your books than can actual artworks, as you say. But do you think that there was intent there, or did you just start writing because?
I think so. Part of the really, really honest answer is I'm involved in this organization called Medicine Unboxed, which is an amazing thing. It's kind of it's kind of a festival conference run by an oncologist and writer called Sam Giglani. And he basically gathers together people from the medical profession, politicians, artists, writers. And the idea is that like medicine at its best is a science and a humanity, and that it looks at the mechanics of the body, but to understand the body holistically, the arts are great at that. So he brings all these things together in these events. Which he basically runs the whole thing, but I'm artistic director, which makes it sound far grander than what I actually contribute. But quite a few years ago, I gave a talk there, And in the talk, I just thought I'm going to, again, like, I'm just going to kind of almost tell the story of one painting coming into being. And a literary agent said, oh, have you thought about writing a book? And that kind of sparked the idea of thinking like, oh, maybe writing. I'd written lots, but maybe a book length thing is like an ideal space to articulate this stuff that I feel incredibly frustrated that that there wasn't an arena. I think you're widening in the audience. I don't know, like maybe it's about I'm interested in like the depth of connection that people have with your work rather than, well, it's like that Rothko quote, which I'm going to butcher, but like that he thought he wanted to make artwork that was for anyone, not everyone. So it's not about making something that's, that's so vanilla that it pleases everyone, but that you make something that isn't aimed at an elite audience, that the things it's engaging with are kind of democratic and aren't just for people with art historical, art critical, or art world knowledge. And yeah, the books felt like a space in which you might be able to reach out to people outside of what feels like this very closed world of the art world. And just speak to people at a kind of a human level, I suppose, as opposed to whatever other level might be happening.
But I think you do that. You kind of do that in the work as well, right? That some of the ambiguity in your work gives us kind of agency to interpret and engage with your work more so than maybe other stuff. So I guess like talk to me about how you like specifically, I guess, engage with ambiguity, or is that something that I'm reading into the work that isn't there, or how you believe that like a layer of ambiguity plays in?
Yeah, one, I think that's the only way that you can make paintings. Genuinely, I feel that. But I think you're right. There's a particular type of ambiguity in my work. I think looking at a painting as a active, not a passive experience. And so the idea that you would make some kind of top-down, authorial painting that is like me somehow preaching to a viewer seems absurd. It seems to go against what the medium's good at. Whereas making something that kind of brings the viewer actively into the experience. And so I think of my paintings as, this is like horribly pretentious, but I do think of them as this, as like psychological hinterlands. And as like you've built the space and the place, and then you're bringing a viewer to it, and then their experience of that, whether it's narrative, whether it's psychological, emotional, formal, whatever it is, all the different ways you can engage with the painting is then open. And that isn't saying anything goes, and a painting can mean anything. But a painting is there's an amazing Ursula Le Guin essay called The Carrier Bag Theory of Fiction. And she talks about how for too long there's been literature that writes about tools and weapons, and that the early forms of civilization are all about these things that are a doing thing. They're trying to kill something or beat something. And actually the earliest forms of civilization really are about carriers and containers. And they're about going and collecting seeds and bringing things back to home and nurturing and helping. And she inevitably and rightfully kind of frames that in gendered terms as to why that's happened. And I kind of think of a painting as a container full of seeds. And you can empty it and fill it with all kinds of things as a viewer, but it has to fit the container. So what I'm not saying is, you just come to a painting and this can mean anything. It has to, for it to be like profound or meaning, it obviously has to make sense between like the individual and then what's going on in the painting. So you're kind of just bringing a viewer to that place. And then, so it's interesting that you kind of described some of them as like landscapes, because even though they're not traditionally landscapes, I think they are places. And they're like places of arrival that you're just dropping someone into. And you've gone, you're not there, but your presence and trace is there. And they're kind of aware of you as this. They're aware of a painting as a presence of a presence that speaks of absence, because it speaks of your absence as the painter. So there's always this like form of also desire going on between the viewer and the painter. And I find that like a very charged encounter.
And maybe a bit of like mapping. I keep coming back to that like you're mapping something with no final destination.
I think that is exactly it. Yeah.
Right.
Painting as cartography. I think that's brilliant.
Yeah. And then what about collaboration, right? You've collaborated a ton with other authors, you've collaborated a ton. There's Convergence, right? Which I think you did a bunch of like multimedia, and I tried to really hold on to that. It's hard having not seen it myself. But how does collaboration feed into what you're doing on a day-to-day basis?
So yeah, loads of the projects I work on will be like slightly absurdly like, projects over 4, 5, 6, 7 years. Like they never intend to be, but they are. And they often involve, collaborations with writers, with academics, with filmmakers, with musicians. And the idea is like it seems to be that the idea is to kind of collectively build a world, and that world might be connected to literature or history or geopolitics or mythology. And the idea makes it sound too planned. Often there's like multiple outcomes. So you might have like outcomes, the paintings might be an outcome, a film might be an outcome. There might be a Venn diagram of how all the things interrelate to each other. And I do keep asking myself, like, why are you constantly collaborating? Why not? It would make a far clearer path forwards and upwards if I just went, right, I'm just in the studio, I'm just painting, nothing else, by myself. It's an easier thing to understand. And I think with collaboration, it's about sharing, but it's also about mutation. It's like how you take one thing and you move it from one medium to another and it shifts. You move it from one person's head to another and it shifts. And it's about how collaboration helps you build all this material that kind of you chuck into the studio, into this kind of growing archive. And it troubles you and it pushes you and it frames, it might open things up or it might put limits. And I'm interested in how the different art forms speak to and from each other as well. That seems really important. So yeah, it's not a practical. Definitely, I think people often find, again, I've had so many people have said kind of like professionally, like, you need to clear all of this out. Just make the paintings. Like, and there's obviously some like kind of drive where I can't, like, I've got about probably 6 projects on the go at the moment that are collaborative. Like, even when I think I just need one. So somewhere there's a kind of just an urge. It isn't strategic at all.
Did you go to art school?
So I did. So my path was, I was torn between, so it's funny, we now live in Oxford, and everyone at the school I was at said, don't, going and studying art is mad. Trying to be an artist is mad. So I applied to Oxford to do physics. Because physics and maths was kind of physics, maths, English and art, like my A-levels a long time ago. And then just as I sent the form off, I just thought, that's wrong. I have no interest in going and studying physics. Like, I'm interested in it as a kind of a thing to research and think about. So then I went and did an art foundation. And then from there, went up to Leeds, what used to be the Leeds School of Art. So Leeds Met, did a fine art degree. Finished that feeling crazily lost. Like, feeling like I was making terrible paintings with no idea what they're about, with no kind of, felt like I had no critical thinking, no sense of the history of art. I felt like a bit of a fraud. And I then ended up I basically looked up history of art courses. So then I went to Cambridge and did the history of art degree. But I very actively did the history of art degree as a painter, as in my head. So like, I wasn't thinking like, oh, I'm going to become an academic, or oh, I'm an art historian. So I purposely decided I wasn't going to paint for the time I was there. I was just going to like properly dive into the books and the thinking. And then left Cambridge, lectured for a bit, and then returned to Cambridge on a couple of like residencies and fellowships, which basically kind of kickstarted the career, because they were like funded fellowships to just get on and paint and research. And that was, I think so I graduated from Cambridge in like 2007. So I suppose that since then is when I've been like an artist as my job, if you like.
Can you remember the moment, or is there a moment where, like, one thing where you just accepted, you were like, oh, okay, now it's official, I'm an artist?
Yeah, it's really interesting, because I did quite a lot of mentoring for artists and writers. And I say to all of them, like, you're an artist or writer, once you just say you are, and you are one. The second you kind of attribute it to like a professionalization, I mean, that raises all kinds of problems anyway. So the second you're like, well, I'm not a writer till I have a contract, or I'm not an artist till I have a gallerist, a gallery. So in some ways, one answer to that would be probably when I was like 14, 15, it was like, I'm an artist. That's like what I am. Like I wanted to be an artist from that age. But yeah, then in other ways, even now you have, I don't have any worries, obviously, calling it myself, but I still, for instance, I still kind of think I like exist in some ways, kind of on the fringes of certainly where I would like to be in the art world. So in some ways you still feel a bit of a fraud, as if you're kind of playing a role or performing. But yeah, probably a couple of years after, say, graduating, when I was like, oh, I'm earning, I could quit the lecture, and I was like, I'm earning enough to just about scrape by doing this. It's probably when I started saying it to people publicly.
Do you ever worry that the hyphen is what's keeping the art world from, right? Like the books are such a big, amazing part of your practice. Someone could argue that the books are kind of bigger than the artworks in some ways because of their reach, right? Does that ever worry you?
It did. And so, yeah, because another part of the practice is I do what I suppose would be called illustration. So I've illustrated 2 of my wife's children's books. And then now that seems to be just another part of my career. And that's been really interesting, because the way I make that work is basically no different to how I make, paintings that will be exhibited. It's just a different format that it's ending up in. And definitely people find that, and those books, to be brutal, I'm really proud of them, to be brutally honest, like, their success is almost certainly built on her success. So those books are like, without doubt, the most successful things I've done. And so then obviously then people start to know you for that, and then they get confused because they think, well, illustration of children's books and painting, and and there shouldn't be any confusion, because you're like, this is all just, like the images in the books are paintings. None of them are digital or anything. So it's just existing in a different form. But yeah, I think it has frustrated certain opportunities, because I think some people within the art world, or probably, to be fair, in any industry, like to be able to kind of neatly package you up. And I think they often go, and like you said about attention spans being short, like I think they go, there's just, okay, this must be nonsense. There's too much going on. He's doing too many things. So he must be a fraud. Which may or may not be true. But yeah, I think it confuses people.
I think though, right, it's you tackle these kind of big existential questions, and you walk this line between your personal journey and a much larger, like, universal, or it's everything, whether it's the work or the books. I've been able to put myself in them, which is pretty remarkable. I guess I'd be curious to know how you think you take something that is so micro, right, as in your own personal experience, and open it up.
I honestly believe that, like, the micro and the macro, so moving from like the specific to the metaphysical, like, that's kind of the only way to get to, without being, like I said, about like fridge magnets, like without kind of dealing with like fridge magnet philosophy, the only way to get to deep universal truths is to be unbelievably focused and specific. And then if you go, I'm going to absolutely zoom in on this experience. So whether it's like something I've gone through, whether it's a line in a poem, whether it's a whole play that you're engaging with, if you're specific, that will then open up to things that are universal. And if it opens up to things that are universal, then you're creating things that are hopefully invitations to someone to come to and see the rhymes and the echoes with their own experiences or their own, view of the world or history. And I think the second you move away from that and you start by trying to be universal or make the kind of the big grand statement, it just becomes glib. So I think you just kind of have to trust, almost like if you're looking through, if you make work that's like looking for a microscope, that you'll stand back and you'll go, oh, that wasn't indulgent. because it suddenly becomes about more than that.
What do you think is the biggest misconception about your work or about what you do?
I think people always think I'm amazed at how often I think this, like, they'll say, God, it's just full of horror and angst and pain and noise. And then so often I kind of see melancholy and beauty and tenderness and vulnerability. And I think that could be a flaw of, like, again, like, where if I'm seeing the stuff that's kind of under the surface and they're seeing like the first, you're seeing big, high contrast images, you're seeing a screaming mouth, whatever. And I've thought about that a lot recently, and the work is therefore changing as a result of that. So firstly, that, I think too muchness. I think people think it's too much. Like, everything. I've been told that a lot. Like, you're doing too many things. What you're doing is full of too many. It can't be all these things. And so then I try and strip things back, and I'm just not able to. So I think, what it's like in the art world. I kind of inevitably had dreams of, like, right, in my early to mid 20s, I want to have this, like, success that just blasts straight out of art school, and you're like the hot shot of the moment, whatever that means. Like, and then you think, okay, it's not that, but you just work really hard on, like, mid 30s, and then it's like, you get with a gallery, have a few shows, then you get taken up by bigger gallery. So there's that path. And so I plotted that path, and then it's like, so I've had I've been represented twice by galleries, and then so one gallery went under, and the other, there was very sadly recently a death. So, like, there's been these things that kind of out of my control. But then also I think where, like, what I'm doing in my work takes time for people to get, when they do get it, if they do, like, I think there's lots of people just don't like it, which is fine. So now I'm like I'm nearly 41. So, but now I'm like kind of relaxing. Is that fair to say? Like, I think my wife would probably say not, but like relaxing into, like, maybe this happens when you're 60. Like, and also, what is it that you're wanting to happen? Because you say that, and then people might think, oh, okay, has nothing happened? Have you not had any successes? And I'm probably thinking really crudely, like a handful of blue chip galleries. I'm like, yeah, I want to be with them. And then you think, really, like, do you? And yes, in some ways, like, absolutely yes. But also, I think it would have been a disaster that had happened to me in my 20s, like a complete disaster. So I don't think that was your question. But anyway, yeah.
Misconceptions. It is. It's good. And it's really good to hear, right? Especially for if other artists end up watching these interviews, that, like, I always think about this with other industries. Like, if you want to be a doctor, this is the path you take. You want to be a lawyer, this is the path you take. A banker, path you take. And it's all a well-trodden path, and it's really linear, right? There are steps. You take them, you're good. The art world doesn't have that. It doesn't have it for art historians. It doesn't have it for curators. It doesn't have it for artists. It's all just this, like, I don't know, like, good luck.
Yeah.
And like, defining success for ourselves is really important. And kind of understanding where we want to be and what the work is for, right? And it's really, it's incredibly interesting for me to hear you talk, because we have some weird parallels that I didn't know. And it makes me think, well, if you and I do, as in, so I went to university, I wasn't allowed to do fine art because my parents were like, we're not sending you to American university for stupid amounts of money. And for you not to have a degree that you can use, like, good luck. You can double major, sure, but you'll have a proper degree. So I did English and fine art. And then while I was doing fine art, because I went to a liberal arts school, I had to do a bunch of art history. You had to do equal parts sort of practical and historical to even get close to a minor in fine art. And then I fell in love with the scholarship and realized I was actually far better suited to talk about artists and why they were so inspiring. Anyway, it was just interesting to me. And then you touched on melancholy, and like that for me, sadness and melancholy are the emotions that come to me fastest. It's not to say like I'm a sad person, but more that like morose songs and sad poems and tragic books. Like that's my wheelhouse, right? And same with art that has like weight and feels heavy. So if I do think it's this thing of that you do particularly well, that like your own experience is embedded in your work, whether it's the literature or the kids' books, right? Like my kids love your books, or your paintings. There's something so deeply personal about them, but that actually they become mine.
Yeah.
It's not a question. Not a question. Just telling you.
I,
Good job. Thank you.
I think, I mean, that means a lot. That's and interesting to hear the parallels. But not the last solo show, the one before that I had, that was at Number 20 Arts, which is the gallery where sadly the gallery's closed down. Sadly, and Sienna has died, who was a really good friend. So it's kind of really tragic. I remember like early on in the first show I had with them, From Darkness, like a couple of years ago, and kind of thinking, like, oh, this isn't going as well as I thought for sales. Like, I really thought this was going to be like fly off, be this amazing first week. And there were sales, but just, I don't know, I just had this like feeling. And then someone went to the exhibition who has now become, who I didn't know, but has now become a really dear friend, and had this experience in front of one of the paintings, had read nothing about the work, knew nothing about the show, just been walking past, and had this like, incredibly profound experience. But they ended up like in like shaking tears, and they said they felt like they were haunted, like there was like a ghost in the room. And it started, and I'm not going to mention this, although they've now written an essay about this, but anyway, because it's their story, but it started speaking to some very like hard, melancholic, traumatic experiences of theirs. And it weirdly rhymed with so much that was going on in the work, but not at a subject level basis. So like different subject matters. It's not like, there's a figure doing X. Oh, that is like this. It was clearly functioning at a kind of psychological, emotional level, and it moved, how it's moving them. The only reason I say all of that is like, you then go, oh, that's why you make paintings. But obviously you also need to like, that's the success. Like that's a far bigger success than like if, rather than like it's selling quite well in the first week, rather than instead of it like selling out, you're making work because you want people to have like profound experiences. You want those kind of deep forms of connection. And you have to obviously remind yourself of that everything else is a game. So if I'd like to be, for instance, with, as I mentioned, like blue chip galleries, this or that, like that's because they would provide an opportunity to be showcasing your work in such a way that the number of people you might reach and do that to grows. That's why you want it, not because, it puts 2 extra zeros on your price or like that's all. And putting 2 extra zeros is lovely, but that's because that frees up your studio practice more because you have more money to make the work. So it's all, you have to just remind yourself what the hierarchy is, because otherwise you get caught in playing the game. And if I would then make very different paintings, if I was just thinking like this is a game to play, I know the paintings I'd make and they'd be very different to the ones I make now.
Okay, then last question. If your art, if the paintings had a voice and they could shout one thing or like one message,
oh gosh,
what would that be?
Well, that's a really good question. I feel like I want to go away and think about that for like a year. Like even if they could shout one. I think I like the idea of paintings as like invitations for the viewer to step imaginatively into them. So maybe whatever word kind of says, like, I can't think of a word that doesn't make them sound accidentally creepy. Like some kind of word that's like inviting you into the space in the world of the painting. Also, I am interested in the idea of like paintings as spells and as haunted spaces. So maybe all of this is about them saying something kind of accidentally. I'm just going to accidentally haunting or ghostly or. So I think my first book will grant to like the opening line is something like, I suppose this is a ghost story of sorts. So like the idea of a painting maybe whispering something that you're not sure you've heard. Then I know what it is. So there's a line in Ovid, in a particular translation of Ovid's version of Orpheus and Eurydice, and he talks about Orpheus entering the underworld and descending through the underworld in his attempt to bring Eurydice back from death. So he's kind of entering the space of death. and they talk about him passing through and past thin ghosts. So like the idea of a painting just kind of whispering out thin ghosts.
I love that. I love that. I used to again, you've done it again with an answer, right? Like my dad has been in the UK my whole life. And when we'd come to see him, he had a client who was right around the corner from the Wallace collection. So he would drop us off there. I mean, this is the 80s, so you could do stuff like this. He'd sort of nudge a security guard and say, "I'll be back." And we'd just roam around the Wallace. And that place is full of paintings that have ghosts. And they are like, you can get lost in all of it. So that speaks to me too. Well done.
I like that.
I have no clever closing remarks. I will, as I said, I will spend some time wrapping my head around this conversation along with your work and try and put a bow on it for everybody. But salient points here are: everyone must absolutely buy some books, look at the work, stay tuned for the book in May. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was great. Really fun.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Scene Podcast. If you liked what you heard, I'd love it if you subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And if you want to connect with us between episodes, follow us on Instagram at WatchSceneArt. I'm Carrie Scott, and I'll see you next time. Get it?